going through what could be called as an extraordinary purple patch where animal spirits at corporate level have revived. Things are looking up at a consumer level. The startup economy is improving, and now we are enjoying what really could be called as a pedestal positioning in terms of global India in terms of a global investment destination. Mr. Subramanian, fantastic to have you back on ET Now. Thank you for joining us. You know, as journalists, we love to analyze the commas and the dots and the full stops to find the fault line. But for a change, I must say that things are not looking good, but things are looking very good for India.
Yes, Nikunj, I think the last 2 quarters, the growth has been quite good. Now, India has therefore emerged as among the very few countries that has had 4 consecutive quarters of positive growth amidst a once-in-a-century pandemic. India has had the self-confidence and the courage of conviction to be different from the rest of the world in not just implementing demand-side measures, the Keynesian, demand priming. Instead, we've followed the Hicks-Samuelson, accelerator multiplier framework of focusing on capital expenditures, thereby expanding supply, and also doing important reforms on the supply side, as a result of which not only has growth revived actually most sharply among emerging economies, we are actually also seeing macro fundamentals being very strong, whether it is inflation, which is actually less than 5%, a current account which is which is comfortable, and fiscal deficit which is less than peer economies. And I just want to contrast our performance in the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, when we became part of the fragile 5, because we ended up just doing the Keynesian demand priming, and we had double-digit inflation for 18-month, current account deficit that was close to 6%, and fiscal deficit that was 2.5 times that of peer economies. And that's what led to us becoming part of the fragile 5. I think so. Both revival of growth and sharp revival, as we had predicted, the V-shaped recovery in growth, together with excellent macro fundamentals, I think is something that India should definitely be very, very happy about.
Mr. Subramanian, the COVID has unexpectedly solved 2 problems. One big problem was about interest rates and structural higher rates, interest rates India, and B, on forex reserves. So those 2 problems are unexpectedly getting sorted out. Big relief for all of us. But it has created what could be called as a supply shock. And that supply shock is not going to go away easily. What looks like a great revival for the commodity sector and for a lot of other sectors could also be a function of supply shock.
No, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the other economies, the United States is seeing a 30-year high in terms of its inflation. Having lived there for a decade, I can tell you that typically US consumers expect about 2% inflation. Now they're actually getting 6%, plus. And that is because they've only done measures on the demand side, nothing on the supply side. Same is the case with many other economies. And, looking at countries like, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, etc., which are actually seeing inflation touching close to 20%, and that is because they all did only supply side measures, and did not recognize the fact that that COVID is a big supply side shock, because when you have to do lockdowns, when you have to do night curfews, inevitably it leads to supply side disruptions. And so if you did not account for that and had the clarity and the foresight to actually take care of that through supply side measures, that is exactly what would result. That's a textbook illustration of what we learn in macroeconomics, and I think India has been different in that. Another point I would say, yes, commodity prices have gone up significantly precisely because of these, the demand going up without change in supply. But, for us, if you look at in terms of inflation, a large proportion of our inflation, retail side comes from the from the food economy. About half of retail inflation is food inflation, and I think there some of the measures have actually have helped. So while some of the global factors, including commodity prices, will play some role, I think their role is not as large as that of the domestic factors, where the policy measures that we've taken, I think, will hold us in good stead.
You've commented on this on public forums, but I want to revisit the reform piece once again with you. Reforms on the labor front, reform on the land front. These are important reforms which the government has implemented. An impossible divestment like Air India finally has seen light of the day. It was a very tough one, but it has been achieved. But when it comes to the emotional reform, which is the farm reform, it just pours cold water on all the good things one rollback has done.
You're absolutely right, Nikunj, that farming not only in India, in every other democracy generates emotion that is disproportionately high. I will cite the example of Germany. Last year, while we were having protests here, you had German farmers who were actually blocking highways with their tractors. In fact, at that time, I wondered why Greta Thunberg and others did not tweet about the similar things in the Western democracies. They actually singled out the world's largest democracy, which was actually facing things that were actually very similar to those in Western democracies. And that duplicity aside, I think the fact remains that emotion is something that is actually generally high in agriculture across all democracies, and India is not an exception. That said, though, I think the reforms that have been done are all intended towards bringing more competition in factor markets, whether it is labor, whether it is on manufacturing. So for instance, in the presentation that I did after the GDP numbers came, I showed how our logistics costs have gone down for manufacturing firms, how our power costs have gone down, reliability has increased significantly. We've actually removed some of the obstacles to growth that MSMEs faced because the perverse incentives they had to remain dwarfs, in other words, remain small despite aging, by changing the MSME definitions. We've actually implemented the PLI scheme that incentivizes growth again, because growth is very important to reap economies of scale and thereby reduce costs. If you take the amendment in the retrospective taxation, the telecom sector reforms, which is very important for powering the digital economy, when you put it all together, along with the fact that our enterprise policy now has actually come a full enlightened circle, with the commanding heights of the economy being given to the private sector. This was part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat 1 announcements. You put it all together, you can start seeing that labor, capital, and aspects that affect total factor productivity have actually been really worked on in a systematic manner through policy, which is basically showing up in better manufacturing prospects, and will show up in service sector growth as well as we go forward.
So that's one big concern which is getting addressed, which is that how has India, or how will India now become competitive in manufacturing? The big challenge is now getting addressed. But that does not, in a sense, address the biggest challenge which we have on the agri side, which is the root cause of inflation, which you also just alluded to. If farm reforms are not carried, looking at the structural of the agriculture supply chain here, agricultural prices and food and vegetable prices will stubbornly remain strong. Until the time that is not addressed, we will always have this argument. We will always keep on troubling you with your view on inflation with no solution in sight.
No, you're absolutely right. Inflation, as I was mentioning earlier as well, almost half of inflation in India comes from food inflation. And that is because we actually do not have enough storage infrastructure. One aspect in which agriculture is different from other areas, it is that while demand is all through the year, supply is seasonal. And because supply is seasonal, therefore storage is something that is intrinsically extremely important in agriculture. If you look at every advanced economy, they have provided incentives for storage, private storage. In contrast, in India, the 1955 Essential Commodities Act actually treats all storage as hoarding. If you treat every storage as hoarding, how will you ever provide incentives for infrastructure for storage to come up? In which case, then you will have these kind of volatility, because whenever supply is something that changes, because demand remains the same, onions, potatoes, vegetables, milk, eggs, we need that all through the year, and yet we do not have enough storage infrastructure for that. I think because we've not provided incentives, overall agriculture needs far more markets to be functioning. I think this is something I am absolutely happy crying hoarse about, even if there is a lot of opposition. I'm absolutely okay saying this, because this is what I'm saying is in the country's interest, and despite any opposition that will come from vested interests, I will keep saying it, because this is something that is incredibly important for agriculture to really go up to improve. And the prospects of our small and marginal farmers, they are the ones that actually hurt when we don't have opportunities for them. I think it's a simple point that every other producer in this in India can go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants, except the small and marginal farmer. There is a lot of rhetoric that is poured here, but when you look at the reality, it is a fact that we've just undermined the opportunities for the small and marginal farmer. I think rhetoric is not enough right now. We actually need the small and marginal farmer to be actually taken care of by enabling the opportunities that markets provide to reach him.
Let's talk about the other big reforms which are there on the anvil, and the next big one could be perhaps privatization of IDBI Bank or BPCL and some other banks which the government has indicated. Now, privatizing an any government enterprise is always difficult. A, there is labor issues. B, there is a cultural change. Given that right now the emotional cord has worked with farmers, what about other tough divestments which also involve labor, like a BPCL, IDBI Bank, because you'll have to go through the unions here also?
So here's where I would be a little careful in extrapolating what we see in agriculture onto other areas, because as we just discussed earlier, not only in India but in every other democracy, agriculture evokes disproportionate emotion. That is not necessarily the case in other areas, and therefore I do not think what you see with agriculture is necessarily something that you will see in other areas. And as for culture, let me actually point out very clearly, in the 2020 economic survey, we had gone and referred to the India that was up until 1750 AD, accounting for more than 1/3 of world's GDP. That India was not built by basically public sector. That India was built through trade, and trade that was done by private parties. And if you go and read the Arthashastra, Chanakya actually writes about this. In fact, he actually says that it is the duty of a king to remove all restrictions on economic activity. He talks about actually enabling trade, about enabling Indian entrepreneurs to actually not only go abroad but also foreign entrepreneurs to come and sell their wares here in India, so that the Indian citizen actually, or the citizen of that king can actually get access to products that are not made in India. This is what is our culture. Let's remember that the 45-50 years of socialism that we had actually was never part of India's DNA. Socialism, if you go and read, that was actually an import from the West onto India. India's DNA has always been one of actually enabling markets, much greater trade. Our entrepreneurial spirit has actually been second to none. 45-50 years of actually socialism just ended up dulling that entrepreneurial spirit. So we need to return back to our DNA and really, what are our thinkers really, pushed for really, acknowledge that and go and implement many of those. That is what will bring back prosperity. And I think, what we've seen after liberalization is also testimony to these principles working, not only historically up till the half of the 18th century, up till 1750 AD, but even after liberalization. So clearly, I think we have to recognize that there's been a cultural degradation because of the socialist era policies that we followed, but that is not India's DNA. India needs to return back to its DNA. After all, we write Shubh Labh, in our homes, right? In other words, make profit by doing good is something that is part of our culture.
That's a great point. So let me ask you a simple and a straightforward question. When will we become a $5 trillion economy? 2 years, 3 years, 3.5 years?
Nikunj, I think we have to recognize here that every economy, across the world has been impacted by the pandemic. Not only has the pandemic affected economic goals, but it has also created uncertainty, because about a month back, most of us were sort of thinking that, maybe the Delta variant would be the last one, and yet now we are actually seeing the Omicron variant. So during such periods of uncertainty, till we, sort of don't see some resolution of this uncertainty, I think it will be very speculative at this point to actually, say anything on that part. But I think there's no question that we will definitely reach there soon.
Let me ask your view on something which I've been meaning to understand from you, and I'm so glad that we're getting a chance to interact today on this public forum. There are 3 balance sheets in India, sir. There's a consumer balance sheet, there's a corporate balance sheet, and there's also a government balance sheet. You analyze all these balance sheets very closely. What is your view on the 3 balance sheets? Because the sum total of your view on these 3 balance sheets will tell us that where the growth is headed and where spending and demand is headed.
That's a nice classification, Nikunj. I will actually add one more nuance to it, which is, on the consumer and on the, corporate balance sheets, I will segregate it into the informal and the formal, because you have, consumers who are also workers in the informal sector who work for firms in the informal sector. So there is that classification as well. When you look at that, take this framework that you very nicely suggested, I think the formal sector has clearly emerged very well from the pandemic. The corporate tax rate cut that we did in September 2019, certainly it wasn't in anticipation of the pandemic, because nobody knew the pandemic was coming at that time. But that proved to be fortuitous, because that ensured that the formal sector firms had enough cushion so that they don't have to actually go and sell their assets in order to take care of their debt obligations. And as a result, productive capacity has not been impacted. Jobs in the formal sector are also coming back very quickly, because these formal sector firms have not been impacted, that much. In fact, they've also cut costs and thereby, have come back healthily. They also have deleveraged, and there the interest rate environment has certainly helped in the deleveraging as well. So that's on the formal side, both from the corporates and the, the consumers that are basically workers in the formal sector. When we take the informal sector, again, I'm going to collect the workers and the corporates together, because there is a matching there. Consumers are basically workers for the firms in the corporate sector. There has been, more impact. The informal sector has been impacted more than the formal sector. But I think it is important to recognize here that the nature of production that happens is that, in the informal sector, labor is far more used. Capital is very, very limited. Even when capital is used, it's typically through money borrowed from friends, relatives, etc., not from the formal sector, who come knocking and say, if you don't repay, I will actually take your firm into bankruptcy. That doesn't happen. As a result, the, informal sector during, tough times actually does not suffer as much hysteresis as formal sector sector firms can suffer. So loss of productive capacity is lower. So while the informal sector is certainly impacted, more during the pandemic, it will come back, and there won't be hysteresis. So that's what, if you, think about it in terms of the two major balance sheets, which is your corporates and your consumers. Now, as for the third balance sheet, which is the government, there's been a very important change that has happened. One, that balance sheet is actually showing far more spending on capital expenditures, which actually create assets in the economy, compared to just revenue expenditure, and multipliers, fiscal multipliers, which actually is just economists speak for how much money gets added for to the economy if the sovereign spends 1 rupee. That multiplier is much higher on the capital expenditure side than on revenue expenditure. So that is, I think, a very important distinction. At the same time, we're also seeing, I think, some change that may be permanent. Actually, I will wait for the data to come in, but looks like the tax to GDP ratio may be on a very important rise, and could possibly be permanent. But because I think data is still coming in, I would not yet make it very that statement emphatically. But it could be the case that tax revenues are improving significantly. So that is also something that is changing very importantly on the government balance sheet. The other thing that has happened to the government balance sheet over the last 7 years is that the efficiency with which the government runs the welfare programs has actually increased significantly. The use of JAM Trinity, we showed this in the 2018-19 economic survey on Manrega, how it has reduced a lot of the pilferage. I think as a result, the money that is spent on welfare by the government, the efficacy of that has also improved significantly, compared to pre-2014. So these are the important changes that have happened in these three balance sheets.
The Prime Minister today was addressing a Fintech forum, which means the government and the administration is excited about the good work which is happening in the Fintech world. Now, in a boom time or in a economic growth, we can always see that there are pockets of euphoria and bubble which get created. As the Chief Economic Advisor of India, are you somewhere worried about the kind of startup valuations are getting created, the kind of flows which are getting created there? These are great franchises because entrepreneurs are making them great. But the kind of flows and the kind of euphoria which is getting created, does that worry you that this is a bubble which could get pricked?
Nikunj, let me first lay out, the conceptual ground for, what is happening on fintech in India. If you look at, India over the last 6-7 years, there's been huge improvements in the digital infrastructure, and I'm talking about the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity, more than 40 crore accounts where you have now 6 years of data on transactions where direct benefit transfers are going into these accounts and money is being pulled out for spending. So you have data on transactions that can actually be mined, for assessing credit risk, the ability to pay and the willingness to pay as well. You also have the account aggregator that has been created, which actually manifests the idea that we had pushed in the 2018-19 economic survey about data of the people, by the people, and therefore for the people. The account aggregator is a wonderful manifestation of that idea of data as a public good, because now while maintaining privacy, the consumer can say, here are my transactions that have been collected. I give you the authorization to go and use these transactions to assess whether I am a credit-worthy borrower or not, and thereby decide whether you want to give me a loan or not. So I think the account aggregator, a second very important innovation. Together with that, you actually have the UPI, you also have the e-rupee. When you take all these together and start seeing, India has created this digital infrastructure as a public good, and this is where India has been different from even the United States, where such goods have been created by the private sector. And we know very well when such public goods are created by the private sector, they indulge in monopoly pricing that actually then results in access that is suboptimal. And that has not happened in India. So the private sector activity that you're seeing on the fintech front actually builds on this foundation that has been created by the sovereign in terms of the digital infrastructure. So that does give me, enormous assurance that there is actually a lot of, data and analytics that is being used, using this infrastructure to actually do the lending. That said, I would, definitely mention that the private sector players have to remember that the seeds for a crisis are oftentimes sown during good times, and therefore irrational exuberance is something that must be avoided. I have worked in the private sector myself and seen how a private sector oftentimes actually starts believing as if there's basically just been a fundamental change. There is some fundamental change, but I think we cannot pretend as if there is no risk. You have to actually be careful about the risk, and the underwriting standards have to actually be cautiously implemented in this. That's the caution that I would actually suggest to the private sector, especially in the fintech space.
Couple of closing comments. I'm going to drive to something which is really the most debated topic globally and even in India. What is the future of crypto? Whether it is India or whether it is in the world. And even though some central bankers globally have raised a red flag about cryptocurrency and the existence of cryptocurrency, are you worried about it?
So Nikunj, I think there are a few aspects that we have to take this into account. Do keep in mind that the Honorable Finance Minister has already made a statement on this in Parliament, and therefore whatever I'm saying is only on the conceptual front, which I've said earlier as well. And that is that the distinction needs to be made between crypto as an asset and crypto as a currency. Economics teaches us that when we think about currencies, there are very important considerations that have to come in. Across time, currencies have always been those that have been issued by sovereigns, and that is for good reason, because there has to, I think what really keeps a currency, provides credence to that currency is the fact that the sovereign backs it. So, I think that's something which is, very important to remember. Second point is, when you think about, even crypto as an asset, an important aspect that has to be factored in is that there is no underlying, that is, backing the price of crypto. If you take a stock, for instance, or equity stock, the cash flows of that firm is what is actually, backing for that stock. If you take gold, commodities, there is actually an asset. Unlike that, in crypto, there is no asset that is backing it, and therefore intrinsic volatility can be very high, which also then, impacts the attractiveness of crypto as an asset itself, because historically, again, assets have been those that have actually had typically, more stable values and something that is underlying. So that's the second aspect. Third point, which we actually must remember, is that whenever you take a financial innovation, that is a zero-sum game. In other words, has no benefits for the real sector, or maybe minimal benefits for the real sector, that has to be treaded very cautiously. The example that I use to illustrate this is, tomorrow if you and I, Nikunj, decide to sit and play cards with each other, then what might happen is that money will change hands. Maybe you might become richer at my expense, but collectively the two of us will actually hold the same amount of money that we started with, at the start of the day, and we would have not done no real activity during that time. Real economy would not have benefited anything from that activity that we did. This is what happens with a zero-sum game as well. Money changes hands, but does not necessarily, flow into the real sector. One caveat, that the blockchain that is actually underlying cryptocurrency, it has some, the potential even without crypto itself to actually benefit from the real economy, and that has happened even before, the fascination for crypto has caught so much fancy. So I think these are important conceptual aspects that must be remembered, and when you take all that into account, as you can see clearly conceptually, I think it is very clear that unlike those that are in the cryptocurrency world, unlike their claim that crypto is a panacea, it is actually, the truth is somewhere clearly in between.
For the longest time I've interacted with you, you've never commented on the monetary policy. And we've appreciated that. But without getting into a specific on what RBI should do, if I may urge you to just comment on this whole world which central bankers are currently using openly, that inflation is transitory. Is it transitory?
So again, here we should make a distinction between India and the rest of the world. I think in the rest of the world, especially in the advanced economies, I am not sure that inflation there is transitory, because as we discussed earlier, if you only stimulate demand, you do nothing on supply. I think that is Econ 101, something that we learn in our undergraduate studies, that clearly prices will go up and therefore there will be inflation. Unless supply on many of these, commodities and other aspects, unless supply goes up, you will have inflation, in the advanced economies. Here's where India is different. As we were discussing earlier, India actually, had the foresight to see that the COVID pandemic is an important supply side disruption, and therefore we have to actually build for supply. And I mentioned foresight because supply increases do not happen overnight. It takes 2-3 quarters for supply expansion to happen, and therefore foresight is required in being able to see that this is a disruption to supply, and that's something that India did, and that is why our inflation actually is range bound less than 5%. So this is a very important point, together with the point that I mentioned earlier about the proportion of inflation that comes from domestic factors and the factors and the proportion that comes from foreign factors. These are important aspects that must be taken into account when we think about about monetary policy. And here let me mention very clearly that in the real world, you have to think in a dynamic manner. When I say dynamic, in other words, you have to take what will happen over multiple periods. So when fiscal policy actually takes into account that if you do only demand side measures, there will be inflation, and therefore monetary policy will have to unwind that demand, and therefore implement supply side measures as well, so that inflation remains in control. Fiscal policy then provides scope for monetary policy and fiscal policy to be supportive. In contrast, in the advanced economies and many of the other emerging economies except India, that aspect has not been taken into account, and therefore they will all now will have to actually go into the phase where, because demand has been stimulated by fiscal, policy that has led to inflation, monetary policy has to unwind that, and so rate hikes, etc., have to happen in these economies. But here, India has been different, and that difference is something that must be therefore factored in when we think about this aspect.
Final question, sir. When you took charge as the Chief Economic Advisor, what is that one handover you got from your predecessor, and what is that one handover you would like to give it to your successor? So one is the traditional handover, but what would be your handover if you have to add your insights to that?
So the main message that I would give my successor, of course, everybody brings their own stance, their own personality, and whoever is my successor should have should definitely have the both the self-confidence and the courage of conviction to actually have his or her imprint on policy, on thinking on policy. Couple of pieces of advice that I would actually hazard giving. Nani Palkiwala used to actually say very nicely that never give salt or advice unless you are asked. Because you've asked me, I'll actually hazard into that territory. Would be that I think the first most important aspect is that when we are in positions like this, we have to behave in a manner that engenders trust with people whom we work with. I think that is incredibly important. All the arguments that we do construct for policy, all those are incredibly important. They're necessary. We have to have enormous rigor backing each one of the recommendations that we take. But I think eventually, trust is also incredibly important. And I think in that aspect, I would say that, it certainly is not a good idea to behave in a I, me, myself manner. I think, staying within the Lakshman Rekha and thereby, behaving, in a manner that actually supports the team and, being a good team player, I think is incredibly important, because that generates trust. So that's the main piece of advice I would, give. Second, I would say that, over the last 3 years, and, especially post-COVID, India has actually displayed the self-confidence and the courage of conviction to do what is right, without just mimicking the advanced economies, without mimicking the West. And I think the entire team, within government deserves enormous credit for that, especially the Honorable Prime Minister, because he is the one that actually really provides that kind of self-confidence and that courage of conviction. So I think, my advice, therefore, to my successor would be to actually maintain that, that tradition, as we were discussing earlier. It's not as if the invisible hand of markets was something that, that we learned only from Adam Smith. While we may not have used that kind of jargon, trade or private sector activity and therefore, enabling markets has been part of our DNA. I think recognize that and therefore do implement policies that actually are optimal for India by thinking ab initio or first principles, because while economic trade-offs remain similar across economies, boundary conditions are different, or overall economic conditions are different, and therefore we have to have the self-confidence and the courage of conviction to actually think about what is right for India ab initio from first principles. So these would be some of the pieces of advice that I would actually provide, and importantly, I would wish my successor enormous good luck, and I will certainly pray for my successor and for the country to really do really well and take its deserved place in the Committee of Nations.
Also well said that we need to think of ourselves instead of copy pasting what advanced economies are doing. Well, you took charge when things were tough. The tough got bad because of COVID. It got worse. You had to do a lot of heavy defending. You had to come up with original ideas. The eco survey now is distinguished and very different. It's got a unique style. So as a journalist and as someone who represents the ET Now brand, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for always accommodating our interview request every time ET Now has reached out to you.
Thank you so much, Nikunj. Namaskar.